let's get going with this video. I'm interested to see how it goes.
School of Rook, yeah!
I like the beat.
Rucka, rucka, Ali.
Asian. We're the first to philosophize. Unorganized confusion.
Okay, already I'm like, I don't know if you can claim first rights to Asians for philosophy, but they do have a philosophical tradition, the record of which I do believe goes back a fair bit further, than what we have in Western philosophy. Our even pre-Socratics, we don't have any surviving texts from them, but we do have what are called fragmentia and testimonia, fragments and testimony. These are like surviving quotes and whatnot from later texts that allow scholars today to kind of reconstruct what the original texts from pre-Socratics must have looked like. Pre-Socratics would just mean all philosophers who came before Socrates, as the name implies. Socrates himself didn't write down anything, so really then it's with Plato and Plato's dialogues that we get the real birth of strong philosophical tradition, in the West. I mean, philosophical literature in the West, rather. And certainly Asian philosophy, Eastern philosophy, things like the Tao Te Ching go back long before, something like that. Although I might have to double check my dates on that, but it's a tradition that goes back further. Although I would dispute the idea that that means like nobody was doing philosophy other than the Asians. Whatever. Eastern philosophy is not necessarily my area of specialty either, so let's continue.
Like Confucius, or the fat giggling Buddhist who said life is suffering. And
No, Buddha came after Plato, chronologically.
through the centuries, suffering is all Asians did. But in Greece, intellectual chimpanzees were putting things in order. Thales put his banana down and said everything's water, which is dumb. But to
Thales put his banana down and said everything's water. Oh, actually,
tie it all together is what he tried. It's not water, it's fire, said the nigga Heraclitus. And that's
okay. Let's just talk about that for a second to tie it all together. So both Thales and Heraclitus were pre-Socratic philosophers. Pre-Socratic, again, that means they were just philosophers before Socrates. This is going as far back as we have in the Western tradition. And one really interesting theme amongst all the pre-Socratic philosophers is a lot of them were naturalists, philosophically, even kind of materialists, and they were very interested in the philosophy of nature. And this one binding theme throughout a lot of pre-Socratic philosophy was this wide-scale interest in finding what the Greeks called the arche. Arche meant first principle, right? And so in this context, arche, like the arche, the first principle of reality. What was like the first thing that existed, or what's the fundamental basis of the natural world? And a lot of the pre-Socratics in that ancient Greek school of thinking would like to identify with a specific element. So Thales believed water was the most fundamental basis of nature and natural reality because, or at least according to Aristotle later on talking about Thales, his speculation was because Thales noted that, from moist things, things further grow, right? Like when you have moisture, you get mold and plants and insects, and life just kind of tends to sprout from water, right? Water as a nourishment. So therefore, Thales reasons, well, water is therefore the fundamental basis of life. But you have another pre-Socratic like Heraclitus who believed the arche, the first principle, it was actually not literally fire, it was logos, which is where we get the word logic. But he associated fire with logos, because what was logos? Logos was, so Heraclitus thought the whole world was in a constant state of flux and change and strife in that regard. But there was kind of this paradoxical basis of order underneath all of that flux and change. There was something kind of ironically and paradoxically unchanging about the fact that change was constant, if that makes sense. And so this is the idea of realities. You have this paradoxical sameness and order underlying the constant change and flux and chaos of reality. And so the reason why Heraclitus thought fire was fascinating is the way that fire kind of both stands still and yet dances and moves around at the same time. Right? The fire wiggles around and it dances and moves around, right, like a dancing fire, but one that's nonetheless kind of stable and fixed in this one place. And you view that as sort of like representative of the idea of logos, of this unchanging, fixed, ordered basis to the otherwise constant, ever-changing flux of reality. But the point is, then he goes on in the rap here to say, but the point is trying to bring it all together, right? This is what all the pre-Socratics were trying to do. They were trying to find the arche, the first principle of natural reality, to kind of come up with this account of reality itself, sort of the very first kind of area of inquiry of philosophy. But I didn't mean to go on so much there. Let's continue.
Kind of shit that occupied the Athanasian, tying everything together. It's called integration. But that
Tying everything together.
said everything is numbers in a theorem. But
The arche, the first principle to the Pythagoreans was mathematical truths.
there's more to life than numbers, so no one wanted to hear him. Zeno said there's no such thing as change. He got wrecked, but we
Well, Zeno is a student of Parmenides, and is really the Parmenidean view, which is the contrary of the Heraclitean view. If Heraclitean view is everything's in constant change, Parmenides was a radical monist, thought there was really only one thing in existence, and that was being. So there's only really being and not being. And for that reason, there isn't, even though it looks like things are constantly in change, there is no real change going on, because that would sort of involve a contradiction, right? But something, either it exists as it's being, it is, or it is not, right? So there is no real change, because if two things both exist, there's no state of change between them. They're just being and being. And it's interesting, because these things were all very anyway. Zeno was a student of Parmenides. So this is really the Parmenidean view. I think this guy's getting this slightly wrong to pin this all to Zeno, but it's interesting the way these pre-Socratics also heavily influenced later thinkers like Plato and Aristotle. But again, I don't mean to ramble. I've been trying to get better on my lengthy rambles in these streams, so let's continue.
he invented the debate or dialectic when there was democracy.
No, he didn't invent the debate.
He got wrecked, but we know he invented the debate or dialectic.
He did not. So the dialectic is most commonly associated with Socrates, but yeah, it predates Socrates. I mean, this is just something the ancient Greeks loved to do, is debate. They were, especially in ancient Athens, which was a radically democratic society. People loved to debate in that kind of setting.
When there was democracy,
Yeah.
there was Democritus. He was wrong about some shit, but still they call him dad of science. Does the end just
Democritus was an atomist. And he was also a materialist, and he believed, reality could be reduced down to these indivisible components, and that all you really had was like atoms, these most basic components of reality, and void or nothingness, right? And so reality now becomes this conglomerate of just all these different atoms. Again, not atoms in the modern scientific sense, but in a philosophical sense, as an indivisible, most fundamental bit particular. And so there are no real, more complicated objects in that, because everything is really just a composite of atoms and the different arrangements and shapes and sequences that those atoms are comprised of. And so it's a very kind of materialistic view. That kind of modern scientific materialism, there's nothing modern about it. I mean, that goes all the way back to Democritus and the atomists. But let's continue.
defy the me? For Simon said yeah. But tell that to someone dying for someone else's idea. And that's the fate of Socrates. Convicted for corrupting little boys. And for democracy, he drank fucking poison.
Socrates was convicted famously of atheism and corrupting the youth. Those were his charges. That was a weird way to phrase it, though, corrupting little boys. But anyway, let's continue.
Boys in Socrates' class were mostly fake and gay, though. But the first to build a system of
This guy is just trying to be edgy. He's just trying to be edgy.
philosophy was Plato.
Okay, so I disagree with that though, and I thought it was because of that the first to design like a system of philosophy is Plato. And the reason I disagree with that is I thought this is what he was getting at earlier, is a lot of the pre-Socratics had their own like systematic approaches and philosophical worldviews meant to account for all of nature and reality, and yes, had views of ethics and politics and aesthetics, how they interacted with each other. So I think there are definitely pre-Socratic systems of philosophy. But yes, if we want to say that Plato was kind of the one who really designed a systematic approach to philosophy that's really approaching philosophy in the way we tend to think about it even to this day, right? Like right here, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, aesthetics. Those latter three you
He
could
said this
all lump under axiology. So I'd push back on that statement a little bit, but we'll continue.
world isn't real, but there's a world of forms where everything is perfect. He was fucking wrong, but they thought he was right, so his work was
I like how this guy just does. I'm sorry to keep pausing so much. He just hits you with a lot of like really interesting philosophical claims really quickly. So Plato, there was a world of forms. So Plato was famously a dualist. He held to metaphysical dualism. So to Plato, there were kind of two worlds. And actually, we were just talking about pre-Socratics a bit. You could say, so there's the physical world around us, immediately available to our sense experience. And that's a world of constant change in a kind of Heraclitean sense. And it's therefore, constant change and in a way that makes particular things actually unknowable in of themselves. That physical world essentially is like the world of the cave in his cave allegory that everybody starts in, right? The world of immediate sense experience. But then you have the world of forms, or the intelligible realm, which is the world of universals, right? The world of immutable, that means unchanging, universal, eternal form. And these forms were really the basis of reality, fundamentally. They're really the basis of what things really are. Not like the way particular things bear likeness to something, but the thing itself. So you have many beautiful particular things, but then there's beauty itself, right? And so it would say the reality of beauty is in the form, not the particular beautiful things, but the form of beauty itself. And this is what is meant to account for, therefore, how we have knowledge and knowledge of a basis of reality. So this is a very famous kind of dualist approach to metaphysics Plato innovated. And this guy just kind of comes out the gate and says, oh, but he was fucking wrong, though, which I just find very interesting and bold. And it makes me wonder. It reminds me of when I reacted to his Plato versus Aristotle rap battle, and I've detected he had an Aristotelian bias in that video, and he was favoring Aristotle's kind of more hylomorphic, more grounded approach to metaphysics. And I guess we're seeing that bias confirmed here, because he's just straight up not even acknowledging the possibility for some kind of a more dualist approach to metaphysics, which is rather interesting, but we'll continue.
was taught and saved, ironically, which led the West back into a cave. But he paved the way for his student with the system model, just the realest nigga ever to exist, Aristotle.
Yeah.
He wanted
there's that Aristotelian bias coming out again. I wonder who, like, what this guy's background is. Like, who taught him philosophy?
explanation for the shit Plato told him, and he wrote it all down. Pound Plato like a clown. All the bullshit Plato said, Aristotle asked how. His metaphysics still hurts Plato's ass now.
Dude, what? I do not agree with this at all. Like, Aristotle was effectively a Platonist. He just had a more hylomorphic, grounded approach to things like form. Where, Aristotle's famous response to Plato is that he takes those forms and he puts them in the particular things themselves. But anyway, it's just I don't know why this guy goes so hard on Plato, because Aristotle is effectively taking after Plato's view and heavily incorporating so many aspects of Platonism. It's kind of there's a famous Renaissance painting, like, what is it, like Plato and Aristotle painting. Yeah, it's like this one. School of Athens by Raphael. School of Athens by Raphael. This is a famous Renaissance painting. And as you can see here, like Plato's kind of depicted like sort of gesturing up towards the sky, and Aristotle's depicted, like with his hand kind of pushing towards the ground. And the idea is supposed to be this is the famous way their disagreements metaphysically were kind of depicted, is like Plato has this very head in the clouds kind of philosophy, because the basis of reality and knowledge, it's actually nothing to do with the world around us available to our senses. It's like way up there in the intelligible realm. It's somewhere else entirely. It's in this higher realm of knowledge. So sort of head in the clouds. And then Aristotle's gesturing to the ground like it's meant to be this more, this is the basis of reality right here around us. Right? But so they definitely had their metaphysical disagreements, though I did have a professor when I was working on my master's, and I remember when I was doing a graduate course on ancient Greek philosophy, and I remember I had a professor, when we talked about this, he even described it as it's sort of this whole Plato versus Aristotle debate is sometimes a sort of much ado about a philosophical nothing, because in reality, it's like, yes, they had their disagreements, but Plato was Aristotle's teacher. Aristotle was his star pupil. Aristotle heavily took from Plato and heavily incorporated aspects of Plato's philosophy. They had their metaphysical disagreements, but they still had so much more in common with each other than they did anyone else, and certainly many of the pre-Socratics that came before them. So I just tend to not like and tend to not view as favorably this let's beat up on this Plato and Aristotle disagreement like it's so big. And I don't know why this guy has just decided he hates Plato, but he's gonna laud and praise Aristotle. If you love Aristotle so much, you should also love Plato. But anyway.
Aristotle wasn't perfect, but he gave us laws of logic, which gave us shit like PlayStation 1 and Apple Watch.
He didn't give us laws of logic, he discovered them. You're presupposing that statement, he gave us laws of logic, makes it sound constructed, but laws of logic would actually seem to be more universal truths that are being discovered. That's what both Plato and Aristotle would have agreed, so there you go. These two guys you pit against each other would have agreed on that much.
All the cool shit you got, thank Aristotle's mother, which is more than anybody did back when the words were uttered. Nobody gave a fuck, yeah, fuck what he was saying. They was busy eating euros, wrestling naked, being gay, like Epicurus.
What the fuck is with this guy? He's just so randomly crude out of nowhere.
Told him, avoid all pain. The Stoics were like, nah, too much pleasure is vain.
Okay, so Epicurus famously was a hedonist. A hedonist does not mean quite exactly the way we use the word today. A hedonist would be philosophically somebody who would define all that is good as good experience and all that is bad as bad experience, so like pleasure and pain. And they would say, therefore, the best life is one that maximizes pleasure while minimizing pain. But this would not equate to the way people tend to stereotypically use that to mean like somebody just like lying around stuffing their face and being, a total pleasure hog. But actually, Epicurus himself would caution against that, because he would say, if you overindulge in pleasure, then this leads to a proportionally greater amount of pain. Think about, like, if you overindulged eating all your food all at once, then this is going to make you have to go hungry when you run out of food in a few days. But if you had a moderate amount of food each day, it would last you longer without you going hungry. So the idea is, if you moderate your pleasures, then the totality of pleasure you experience in the long run is actually greater. So this is kind of Epicurus's whole thing. But then you have Stoics, like probably the most famous example would be the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Is what he's saying here: too much pleasure is vain, which is a very Stoic approach. The Stoics would say it's more about the good life is more about upholding virtues of character and maintaining a life of virtue, that this is really all that's needed to lead a good life. But anyway, we'll continue.
Hey, they said be serious, focus on what you're doing, but they also pushed away the happiness worth pursuing. And the skeptic, ancient neck, beard, McTow, they said you can't.
Ancient neck, beard, McTow.
No shit, wrong then, gay now. As time passed, Plato.
Fun fact, most of Plato's own academy in the years, decades, centuries after Plato was long gone. It was actually the descendants of Plato's academy that largely turned into the ancient Greek skeptics, or became sort of like a hub or a home base of ancient Greek skepticism. And it's an interesting historical comment on who the real Socrates was. And perhaps Socrates was more in line with how he's depicted in the earlier dialogues as just like, oh, all I know is I know nothing, kind of skeptical troll, as opposed to how he comes off in the later dialogues when he's more just a mouthpiece for Plato's view, which is a bit different from that. It's making a lot more knowledge claims. So just a fun fact about the skeptics is they're perhaps maybe more authentic to the historical Socrates than Plato was. That's an argument. Obviously, it's a controversial one, but it's worth mentioning.
Plato's influence increased. Philo brought him to the Jews. Enter Christianity. Augustine cemented Plato to the West in written pages. Raising faith over reason, bringing in the Dark Ages. And poor Aristotle, dismissed in his day. No one gave a fuck about his jam. And it was cast away. And his fucking name forgotten by a world that shit on him. Until he was discovered by a Muslim? Al-Mamun translated him from Greek and began a golden era when religion let you think. But reason...
So there was a period of time, in the early Middle Ages, when even though Plato's dialogues tended to be recorded much better in the West, a lot of Aristotle's works were kind of just lost or just so obscure they were effectively lost in the European Western world for the whole of the early Middle Ages. And so you have, during that time period, a lot of Platonist, or rather Neoplatonist, development, a lot of Platonist influence on early medieval thought like Augustine, but not much Aristotle going on, except it was in the more Near and Middle Eastern worlds where it was as the new Islamic religion and associated caliphates, political entities, were the ones that actually ended up preserving a lot of Aristotelian texts way better than they did in the West, and converted a bunch of the Greek from Aristotle into Arabic. And that was how it got preserved. And part of the reason why then we had this 12th century Renaissance in the High Middle Ages onward, and we suddenly get an explosion of thinkers like Aquinas in the High Middle Ages who are suddenly bringing in a heavy Aristotelian kind of Renaissance in European and Western thought, is because after the Crusades, Western civilization had come back into contact with some of these classical texts that had been housed in the Islamic world for the past several centuries, but kind of effectively lost in the Western world. And they allowed for Western thinkers to take these like Arabic translations of Aristotle and translate them into Latin. And then this is why you have some works by Aristotle, like De Anima is a Latin title. It means of the soul, but it's in Latin. It's because like the oldest copy we have of that is like a Latin translation in Italy from the Middle Age, high to late Middle Ages, so it's a Latin translation of like an Arabic text that itself was an Arabic translation of the original Greek. So it's kind of a really interesting story as to how Aristotelian thought for a time period in the early Middle Ages was much more prominent and preserved in the Middle East and in the Islamic world, while almost effectively lost to the West. And it wasn't until the much later Middle Ages, the high to late Middle Ages, that after the Crusades, you suddenly get a much bigger influx of Aristotelian thought back into the Western world through figures like Aquinas. But let's continue.
Was rejected by this guy Al-Ghazali, which is probably why Islam today is not too
sorry, I just saw your chat, my bad. Weehe35. Hey, what am I looking at? Irotonic Peak. Well, thanks for the support, guys. To answer your question, what am I looking at? This is a History of Philosophy Rap by Rucka Ali. My last stream a couple weeks ago. I've been on like a 2-week hiatus. This is my first stream back in like 2 weeks. My last stream a couple weeks ago, I reacted to a Plato versus Aristotle rap battle. Kind of went over pretty well. And for some reason, this guy, his YouTube channel is a little old, but he has a like random philosophy themed rap videos. So I'm doing another one today, and this is a history of philosophy rap. But I'm glad, Irotonic, you think it's peak. I appreciated your comments earlier. I saw them, I liked them. But anyway, let us continue.
Fucking jolly. He decided to try to mix faith and reason was retarded, so he threw the precious work of Aristotle in the garbage. The enlightenment of the Arabs was over and departed, but in Europe, Tom Aquinas.
Okay, let me just talk about it real quick. Al-Ghazali, yeah. So it's actually interesting what I was just talking about in the early Middle Ages, when you had this like really Aristotelian kind of golden age in the Islamic world. Well, it was kind of forgotten in the European world. When you got to the more high to late Middle Ages in the Islamic world, at the same time that the Aristotelian stuff's more kind of starting to take off in the West, or maybe slightly before that, actually. I'd have to double check the years on Al-Ghazali. But you get this guy named Al-Ghazali who starts this whole trend of being very skeptical towards classical philosophy and towards thinkers like Aristotle and towards trying to bring ancient Greek philosophical texts into the Islamic world by translating it into Arabic. Because he felt that these things were just totally at odds with the faith-based center of Islamic doctrine, right? And like he would say, he kind of had some radical metaphysical views, like occasionalism, which is this idea that that God is just like the one cause of everything. And so there's just kind of when you're investigating causal relations, you can't even say that like X caused Y, because really like X and Y just merely interacted with each other on whereas the relation between X and Y, that was just the occasion for X to interact with Y. But really, God was the cause of what unfolded between X and Y. And like God is just this universal cause of everything. And this is why things like Aristotelian philosophy, which are really interested in investigating things like causation, it's suddenly increasingly after Al-Ghazali seen as like not super compatible with Islamic thought. And so, whereas almost around the same time or just shortly after, you're going to start getting Aristotelianism influencing the West again. This is exactly what he's about to talk about with St. Thomas Aquinas and figures like that. You're getting a huge drop-off of it in the Islamic world, despite the fact that the Islamic world was where that Aristotelian stuff was originally better preserved in the earlier Middle Ages. But anyway, just some interesting stuff going on here.
I'm just getting started. He learned of Aristotle from this Jewish guy Maimonides, and he got it from a Muslim of Averroes. If ever these three religions found common ground, it's in placing reason over faith, living here and now. The sound of reason cut the silence.
That's true. That's true. Although I don't think Aquinas learned Aristotle from Maimonides, though Aquinas did pick up some interesting influence from Maimonides, including things like metaphysics of God, and things like doctrine of divine simplicity arguably are very influenced by Maimonides and this radical oneness about the metaphysical nature of God. But Aquinas is learning Aristotle from a myriad of sources that are coming back into contact with the West from the Islamic world, not from Maimonides.
Of the Middle Ages, as pages filled with logic, scrutinizing God himself. And the changes made some clergy nervous, but it was too late, cause the dumbest shit they ever did was let the artist paint. Human beauty was depict, love and sex celebrate. Life on earth is the standard, heaven could wait and shit. And though Christ was the one being painted, religion didn't know it was being defanged and shit. That was the Renaissance. Then came the Enlightenment.
The Renaissance was actually very it was very celebratory of religious belief. I think it's more what we're going to get into now, the Enlightenment. This is a period where we're going to start to get into modern rationalism, which is all about questioning heteronymous, this sort of post-Kantian sentiment of questioning and rejecting all heteronymous sources of authority. Heteronymous would mean a source of authority that comes from outside of yourself, right? Like, so autonomous is like self-governing, right? So it's when you determine something. Heteronymous is when you're consenting to or submitting yourself to allowing someone or something else to decide things or rule or govern things for you. And Kant was really big on this, on radical autonomy. And this is arguably one of the big themes of modernism, is radical autonomy. And this means rejecting heteronomy and rejecting a lot of classical sources of heteronymous authority, which could mean political institutions and traditional monarchies and aristocracies, and that's something we see during the Enlightenment, right? A political liberalism take root. But yes, it also turns into questioning traditional sources of religious authority, which were often authoritative on a wide range of things. And this could mean things like the Protestant Reformation, which is just kind of questioning the traditional ecclesiastical structure of, like, the Catholic Church in the West, going back thousands of years, 1,500 years. But it could also mean, and that can also start to turn into questioning the idea of any religious institution or church entirely. Most Enlightenment thinkers, even the ones that were more secular, tended to still be deist. They tended to still believe in God or believe in some form of classical theism philosophically. They just would, reject like a specific religious tradition. Atheism still wasn't super popular then, but it starts to pick up steam around this time.
The other Greek philosophers were studied with excitement. Now the truth could be discovered by no other means than reason. Then shit got more divided than the South and North Koreans. A group of new philosophers, one of whom was Locke, said you can't trust your mind, but your senses and your cock. No reality, so don't think too much, you little bitch. The philosophers who said this are called empiricists.
Okay, this is interesting what he's getting into, because he's about to talk about something called the rationalist-empiricist divide, which I personally believe is often commonly misunderstood and misrepresented and overemphasized in modern philosophy. But let's see the rest of what he's saying here.
On the other side of this dichotomy of mind and body, Descartes and all his niggas said your senses could be naughty. You could only trust your mind to know what is and isn't. This school of philosophy is rationalism.
Right. So this is a very classic kind of undergraduate history of modern philosophy class way of describing the continental versus Anglospheric divide. Continental means like the European continent, right, and like the French and German speaking worlds, whereas the Anglospheric or it's often called British he said empiricist. It's often even just called the British empiricist tradition in the mind. We're talking like by the 18th, 17th, 18th century into the 19th centuries. Because it was very popular in Britain. Kind of, this is another like sort of British versus continental divide thing intellectually, but also throughout the rest of the English-speaking world and the Americas and whatnot. So he talked about Locke, who's probably the preeminent, poster boy for this kind of British empiricism, which is Locke's probably biggest thing is bringing a radical idea of there's no this radical idea of blank slateism, right? Like there's everybody's a blank slate. There are no innate ideas, right? So that's actually a Cartesian term, innate ideas. But Locke would reject that Cartesian language. There's no such thing as an innate idea. All ideas are instead a posteriori, and that means after the fact of experience, right? A priori means prior to experience. A posteriori means after experience. And so the British empiricist, this radical state, this Lockean view, is going to take the position that everything is after experience. Without experience, there's nothing. All knowledge is knowledge of experience. There's no such thing as something you just know a priori or know prior to experience. Even laws of logic and math and all of these things are really just you only figure them out after experience. Right? And so the classic divide here is a Cartesian rationalism with Cartesian ideas with Cartesian concepts like innate ideas. Descartes, the mind kind of comes first and the self comes first and then has to like rationalize its way out to the external world, and then you can start justifying things like experience and experiential knowledge. But to Locke or the empiricist, it's the experience comes first and then knowledge comes after. I do think there is this classic like British empiricist, Lockean empiricism versus Cartesian continental rationalism. I think it's sometimes a misunderstanding, because in reality, a lot of the British empiricists were actually heavily influenced by Cartesian rationalism. And in many ways, you could call British empiricism just another kind of a certain strain of Cartesian rationalism. Because they still are heavily emphasizing, as Roger Scruton in what is his Brief History of Modern Philosophy, he puts it excellently, where he says that, it's the British empiricists. They may be disagreeing with certain Cartesian language, like innate idea, in concepts like innate ideas, but they're still affirming the basic, like the most fundamental, important basis of Cartesianism, which is what Scruton calls the first person privilege, right? Or the appeal to my experience, the appeal to me and my mind and my experiences to justify everything else. There's a Cartesian self-centeredness, as I might put it, that is still very deeply ingrained in that British empiricist thought. And I would even call it really just another form of modern rationalism. So this is a very common way, what he's doing here, British empiricism, continental rationalism. It's a very common way of dividing up modern philosophy, but I kind of somewhat partially disagree with it and always take a little bit of an issue when people frame it this way. But anyway.
That's when philosophy became a shitstorm. Scientists no longer thought philosophy was for 'em. It didn't help philosophy to spare itself the damage. When Rousseau is talking about how true nobility is savage. Philosophers of body versus philosophers of mind. All misguided, but the truth is that the truth.
I think it's a false dichotomy. Philosophers of body versus philosophy. I mean, again, they have their differences in where they're placing certain emphases, but I think they're all kind of modern rationalists in a sense. By the way, that's David Hume at the top on the left. And I think he represents the ultimate culmination of all of this kind of modern rationalism, and even especially the British empiricist tradition. I talked about this in my master's thesis somewhat.
They tried to find. See, they all respected reason. They each wanted to have it. Then Kant said, reason? Reason is a faggot. He modernized.
Sorry. That was kind of fucked up. It's actually kind of stupid thing to say, though, because Kant's whole thing was obsessively rational. It was all about reason. It was about self-determined reason, self-governing reason, right? That's what autonomy was being a self-governing rational agent. And even morality, Kant's whole ethics is all about what's rational, and things like following these rational principles like the categorical imperative, which a rational being just simply determines for itself by virtue of being rational. And or not, it's not that the rational being determines it for itself, but it's that reason itself is determinate of like what is even like moral and morally correct, just because by virtue of the fact that it's rationally universalizable. And so it's like, so in Kantian ethics, it's just to call something moral is actually like very quite literally to call it rational, right? To call, and if you say somebody's being immoral or unethical, or they're doing the wrong thing morally, you're literally essentially accusing them of being irrational. You're saying you're doing something irrational. It's almost one and the same. My point is, Kant's whole autonomy project is hugely about rationality, and there just seems something so grossly wrong with phrasing what he was trying to phrase about like reason. Reason is, I don't even want to repeat the word, but yeah, that's definitely not Kant's view. But I will grant this little bit though, and this gets a little bit in my master's thesis. It can be argued that Kant's whole radical autonomy project is what sort of lays the basis for later thinkers, and like existentialists like Nietzsche, for example, to come along and kind of twist that radical autonomy project into something where the self-definition becomes everything, and everything just becomes defined by the will, right? And this is, I mean, even before Nietzsche, even Schopenhauer, and then especially Nietzsche, like where everything, it's sort of like the will is all that's left metaphysically, and even just the will of the subject, the individual, and everything's just now like this, almost like this will to power, and that's sort of all that's going on metaphysically. It can be argued that Kant sets the stage for later thinkers to really go that way, but of course Kant himself would strongly disagree with those developments. Kant himself was all about reason. He was Mr. Reason, Mr. Rational Autonomy. So it's sort of like, I feel like there's kind of a point that he's maybe trying to make about, he's probably going to go the line of blaming Kant for a lot of problems with modern philosophy, which is a popular view to blame Kant for that stuff. And I'm like 98% sure I know the direction he's about to go. Or actually, he's already saying he modernized Plato's world of forms. Kant famously evoked this divide between the noumena and the phenomena. The noumena are the things in of themselves, and the phenomena are the things as we've experienced them. And so he now separates these two things. There's like my Gatorade bottle as it just exists objectively without any perception or observation or experience of it. And then there's like the phenomenal understanding of my Gatorade bottle as I'm experiencing it and sort of seeing it in my mind in a way where perhaps Kant would argue there's actually a sort of active participation by my mind in that process, and sort of bringing certain things to the table like space and time and substance and property and cause and effect in these certain categories to the table. Those are more mental categories being brought to the table by reason, and not like a part of the things themselves. And then Kant famously says, so the noumena, the things in of themselves, absent the human experience of them, they're just beyond, they're unknowable. You just can't know anything about them. All we really know are phenomena. And so when he's saying he modernized Plato's world of forms, I believe the crux of the accusation is to say that he's essentially calling Kant's phenomenal realm akin to Plato's like intelligible realm or world of forms, which is it's this mental abstraction, separate and distinct from the reality itself. And let's remember at the beginning of the video, he had a clear Aristotelian bias in hating on Plato. And we're seeing some of that come out here. This guy seems to really rather like grounded approaches to metaphysics. I'd be curious if he's a full-on materialist or what. But anyway, I've ranted enough about Kant. Let's continue.
It's Plato's world of forms from before, causing reason and reality itself to go to war. He tried to fix the mind-body split, but only made it bigger. Cause reality requires you to reason, my nigga. Now that reality and
I already kind of touched on this, but yeah, when he says he made this reality mind split, right? Like, again, like reality now as we know it phenomenally, that's what we're reasoning about, and then reality as it exists objectively is no longer really what's within our realm of knowledge. This is the fundamental divide that Kant has created for the modern post-Kantian world.
reason were divorced. Everyone had to pick one and fuck whatever caused. Trying to understand the world became a fucking headache. Hegel said reality and logic are synthetic. Marx pushed reason even farther away. In fact, he said reality depends on closer to a factory. If philosophy ended the age of darkness, it was now laying the blueprints for retarded shit.
So now we're getting into the post-Enlightenment. After you had this great period of celebrating reason and this kind of post-Kantian sort of Enlightenment period, in the 17th, 18th, or from Descartes to Kant to what, you had this whole Enlightenment period that's celebrating reason, and now we get this kind of post-Enlightenment period by like the 19th into the 20th century, where we're going to get waves of existentialists like Mr. Big Mustache Nietzsche here, who I have a couple videos on at this point that I'd recommend if you're interested, where there's this big reactionary pushback against all of the heavy rationalist orientation of the Enlightenment, and this move towards more of an anti-rationalist view, and this kind of this steady deconstruction of things like reason itself and knowledge. But yeah, that's the direction he's clearly going now. Nietzsche loved power and strength, but it's not reaching or a stretch saying he inspired Nazis. No, that's a comment. You can watch my Nietzsche videos on this. I just think that's so inaccurate. Superman, something that Nietzsche gave. Yeah, that's the Übermensch. That's what Übermensch means in English. Literally Superman, although in most scholarship it's translated today as Overman. I think honestly, just to avoid the silliness of now the term Superman is so associated with the comic book character, I think that might be like literally the only reason that Nietzschean scholars and whatnot will prefer now the term or the translation of Overman, just to avoid any comic book confusion. But that is actually what Übermensch literally means, Superman. Uber is super.
Gave us. Too bad he saw people as masters and slaves who are free now in America, land of Thomas Paine, who brought over the Enlightenment from Europe. He explained the right of man is to be free, cause that's his fucking nature. When the Germans came, no one saw the fucking danger. Royce and his boys turned to Hegel for the basics. Dewey said your mind doesn't learn shit, it creates it.
Yeah.
Students went to Germany, brought shit back and spread it, which is why today's smartest, most retarded shit on Reddit.
Okay, so again, he's blaming Kant. He's blaming the continental tradition. I've got this guy pinned now. He's very influenced by the analytic tradition. And so while some could argue this divide isn't as prominent today as it was like 50, 60 years ago, a lot of contemporary philosophy like has traditionally tended to fall along, and contemporary scholarship has traditionally tended to fall along the lines of a sort of analytic versus continental divide. And the continental would be, philosophy more associated with the German and French speaking, parts of mainland Europe. And then analytic would be philosophy associated more with the British Isles and the Americas, or the UK, the US, and just the English speaking world, right? So the German and French speaking worlds versus English speaking world. And the continental tradition in contemporary philosophy tends to have gone in a very like existentialist direction. It's very influenced, by a lot of German thinkers. It's influenced by a lot of the German idealists and later phenomenologists. And I was going to actually say, and then phenomenology, but then weird ways in which phenomenology gets hijacked and turned into existentialism. It's like, I rather like Heidegger. I don't think Heidegger is an existentialist, but a bunch of later existentialists claim Heidegger as an existentialist, even though Heidegger himself would say, like, I'm not an existentialist. But, so like Sartre, and these are the kind of French and German speaking, thinkers who take the continental tradition. It's very like existentialist and even postmodern and also postmodern direction. And then in the analytic tradition, you get in the English speaking world, we've had a steady drive towards this real problem with materialism and scientism, problems that arise out of, in my opinion, post-Humean kind of philosophy. And the analytic tradition, you get it's just weird. You get things like logical empiricism, the logical positivist movement like A.J. Ayer and whatnot, but then that movement collapses, and after like Quine and whatnot, and so you're just kind of left with a lot of analytic thinkers today that like really have an allergy to a lot of continental philosophy, but then it's like their own tradition like has its own serious problems with empiricism and materialism and scientism and all these underlying metaphysical and epistemological problems. And so anyway, I'm not myself super. I don't feel very warmly towards the analytic tradition myself. And I'm also not a huge fan of the continental tradition. I haven't made up my mind on this. I tried to incorporate some of this divide into my master's thesis. I tried to come up with like a third perspective using some kind of a more phenomenological realism and thinkers like Sokolowski and whatnot and Dehar. But I don't know, when you do your thesis, you have to defend it verbally before a board of faculty. And I don't know, I just know that when I did mine, I was really I was really grilled by the faculty, and so maybe it wasn't the best project in the end, but hey, it still got me my master's. Still got approved. But my point is, I think I went on a total tangent there, and I apologize for that. It's like late and I'm super tired. But I'll just say, I've got this guy who made this video pinned as a more analytically inclined thinker in his approach to philosophy, or if I don't even know what his background is, or he's just being like taught and influenced by philosophers who have an analytic background. But that is why notice he continues to beat up on like Kant and these German thinkers. When if you ask me, they are some of the most interesting contemporary thinkers. But anyway, we're actually getting towards the end here. Let's wrap this up.
No reason to reason now that nothing could be known. Pragmatism said take action and follow your emotion. Kids trained to have coherence of a mental patient. This was the birth of progressive education. Integration no longer required. Postmodernism said that your mind could retire. Religion made a comeback. Tribalism too.
Well, postmodernism says it's kind of taking that, in my opinion, that radical autonomy to the greatest extreme. I kind of aligned it with the sort of neo-Nietzscheanism, but it's when you define. Nietzsche talks about how one of the most defining features of this sort of illusory impulse of the Apollonian will, that is the will which engages in this dreamlike world of constructing and creating new values. But one of its biggest features is that of the principle of individuation, where you draw the line around different categories of things. And I would say that right there is one of the biggest defining features of postmodernism, is rendering the principle of individuation entirely this like self-defined impulse of the individual will. And this is why postmodernists like to talk all the time about how everything's a social construct and whatnot, because there's a famous analogy, I forget, was it Murphy or it's Categories We Live By is the title of the book I'm thinking of. I'm just drawing a blank on the name. It might be Murphy. But in Categories We Live By is a famous analogy of the umpire in a baseball game. And when a pitch is thrown, the umpire draws the line, and we as a society and the human mind is drawing the line as to what defines whether a pitch is a ball or a strike. There's no real matter of fact independent of the mind or independent of the will. And it's in fact really just entirely an expression of the will. And just we're going to draw the line and define where the line is as to whether you get, as to whether the pitch is a strike or a ball. Basically, the postmodernist likes to say that that's almost like every category of being is really just us drawing lines around things in this more self-defined manner as extensions of our own will. And I would say that's what defines postmodernism more than anything else. And I don't know if it's so fair to call it something as reductive as, what did he put it, just letting your mind retire. Arguably, it's the opposite. It's letting your mind be very active and creative, right? But anyway, let's try to finish this out. I'm tired.
Without reason, there's just feelings and the group. Without philosophy, scientists can't resist. Oriental mystics claiming their shit is legit. Recycled anti-rationals repeating the same motion. Alleged men of science invoking their emotions. John Rawls said we all should be the same. Social justice is morality. Philosophy became a game of bullshit and semantics that no one understands and nobody gives a fuck about, except for Ayn Rand, the last of the Enlightenment. She tied mind and body and reality to reason, which is great, except nobody intellectual would
disagree. Ayn Rand was not a philosopher. I mean, she was a novelist. She engaged with some philosophical ideas in her writings, but I don't know if I'd call her any of the things he just did.
Give a fuck. Professors wouldn't budge. They must have their reasons, but history will judge.
Very interesting. So we see by his love of Ayn Rand at the end there that I guess he's some kind of a libertarian type, which would fit in line with how I had pinned him as a more influenced by more analytic philosophical tradition. Okay, but that was the History of Philosophy wrap by Rucka. We're kind of in some ways following up after my 2-week hiatus. We're following up on my last react to this same guy's Plato versus Aristotle rap battle, which I recommend for anybody interested. But for now, this is History of Philosophy wrap.